Are there traumas in your early life or in your marriage that seem to be major roadblocks in you moving forward in your recovery? Did you know there are ways that you can systematically remove those roadblocks and find healing? Hi, I'm Kim Pullen, and welcome to the Hope for Spouses Lunchtime Live. This is your first time visiting us. Welcome. We're so glad you are here. We wish we could meet under different circumstances, because I know right now if you're here, it's because you got some major struggles going on in your marriage. And if this is the first time that you've joined us, then I want to give you a little bit of a little background about why I started this ministry. My husband and I were married for 19 years, and then I found out that he had had multiple affairs, and we separated for 4 years. And while we were separated, I pursued my own healing, and my husband went into the world and had his a long-term affair. And then after about 2.5 years, he started getting into recovery. And then after 4 years being separated, we were back together again, and we've been together now for another 4 years, and it's been amazing. We have an incredible marriage. And a lot of it was because we really worked on ourselves, we worked on our own hearts, and we really transformed our relationships with God. But one of the things that I did was I had a conversation with a woman, a very dear friend of mine, Cresenda Jones, who is a therapist. And she really helped me work through a particular situation when my husband and I were separated, where there was a lot of trauma, a lot of emotional pain that I had a hard time getting over. And so I really wanted her to bring her on the show so she can share, because I know some of you guys have very similar issues. And I wanted you to understand a little bit about what we call timeline therapy or neural linguistic programming. So let's go ahead and welcome Cresenda. Welcome, Cresenda.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Why don't you give us a little bit of background on, why you got into this particular type of therapy?
So even though it's called timeline therapy, I just have to be very clear that I am not quite yet called a therapist. In Florida, we have to be really careful that we make sure we only use the titles that we've been given. So in Florida, I'm called a registered mental health counselor. But basically what I've been doing over the last year or so is just coaching, and I love it. So a little bit about myself is just that right now I'm doing life coaching. I do have a degree in mental health counseling, and I'm working towards my LMHC. But all of this started because of my own issues and my own challenges emotionally. I myself have gone to counseling. I think the biggest challenge for me was always perfectionism, which is just such a prison, but also trauma. And growing up in a household with an alcoholic and being also assaulted as a 7th grader, many traumas. And so as a result of that, I've worked on myself for many years. And my supervisor, when I was getting my master's degree for professional counseling, it wasn't my original career, he actually had a class where he showed us timeline therapy. And I volunteered to get rid of a limiting belief that I wasn't good enough. And after he did the technique, the people in the class said it looked like I had a facelift.
Wow.
And like, okay.
Oh my goodness.
And it was that way just because inside of me, all of the pain and the conflict regarding that issue was released. And, to say that I look like I had a facelift, I was like, okay, I'll take it. And from there, because I wanted to figure out how can I keep this state where I no longer feel that I'm not enough, but that I feel like with God, I am A-okay. So I went to the training myself for myself. And since then, because I haven't seen anything like it, it's been my focus, it's been my passion, just to help people overcome those things that prevent us from having a clear mind and a clear heart.
Awesome. So can you tell us, some of these counseling terms and stuff can get kind of confusing. So can you tell us in layman's terms, just kind of explain what NLP is?
All right. So NLP, Neural Linguistic Programming, if you break it down by the words, it's a little bit more easier to digest. Neuro means neurology, about our brain and how our brain functions. Linguistic is about the language. And so here, with Neural Linguistic Programming, we're talking about the language of the mind. Programming is what's inside of our head. Many times we've heard people talk about tapes inside of our head and how do we change those tapes inside of our heads. So that's what Neural Linguistic Programming is about, is how to use the language of the mind to maximize or to consistently achieve our desired outcomes.
Okay. And then what is timeline therapy?
So that's a big question. If you could show the picture of the lady, what that says is that it says that a memory without the emotional charge is called wisdom. And when I saw that meme, it's by Joe Dispenza, and he's pretty famous in this area of work. A memory without the emotional charge is called wisdom. Can you even fathom that instead of hurt and pain and trauma, that inside of you, your head and your emotions, that you actually feel forgiveness, and that you feel like your mind is clear, that you have wisdom, that you're clear in your mind and in your heart? Can you fathom, instead of all the anger, just feeling grateful and feeling content even with, despite all that has happened? Can you imagine, instead of the shame, that you actually feel esteem and acceptance? Those are just some examples of, when you ask me what is timeline therapy, that's what timeline therapy does. It actually rewires our brain, our neural circuits. You guys have heard of, changing the tapes inside of your head, but this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. So what we do is we actually eliminate the negative emotions and limiting beliefs. Like for me in that class, I eliminated the belief that I'm not good enough, and change that to the learnings, the positive learnings that would help me in my future. So timeline therapy is a technique that grew out of NLP and hypnotherapy, but it's a technique that addresses us at the inside of our head, so that we can not carry those negative emotions into today. It is the most amazing thing.
Wow. Well, I know that I hear a lot, especially in my Facebook group, a lot of the ladies are super, have a really hard time with controlling what goes on in their head. And I know, I remember going through that, at least the first 6 months, it was like, just to deal with a lot of the stuff, I felt like I couldn't slow my brain down. And there was I would try to move through stuff, and it was just like, there was just like this huge roadblock in front of me. And I'd heard about, hypnotherapy. And of course, some of us are a little bit reluctant with that, because hypnosis and, there's especially some Christian, some different thoughts, Christians have different thoughts about hypnosis, like you're letting somebody in your head or something like. So what would be the difference between something like NLP and hypnotherapy?
So just in case you didn't know, I think you guys know though, most of what happens in our world and in our lives today is a part of our unconscious mind and programming. So if you take a look at that iceberg, we only see a very small percentage of what's going on in our world today, and that's what's happening in our conscious mind. Those are the choices that we actually make consciously. So our unconscious mind, or that internal programming, that's where most of our decisions take place, our thoughts, our motivations, our emotions, and our behavior. Most of it takes place in our unconscious mind. It's automatic. It's actually below the level of conscious awareness, and we're on autopilot 95% of the time.
Wow.
So the other picture that I would like people to see is the NLP communication model, because I think that really does explain why we have to access the unconscious mind, not to the point of hypnosis, but a light trance to actually change what's going on in our head. If you could show that picture.
Yep, got it up.
So on the right-hand side of the head, you see that we have information coming to us from pictures, our senses. We see things, we hear things, we feel things, we taste things, we smell things, and then we also have self-talk. So all of that is coming into our brains, into our head, these external events. And what happens when things come into our minds are that we have these filters. God is so amazing. Neurology is unbelievable, neuroscience. But what neuroscience has taught us is that we have three main filters. And those filters are: we delete things, we distort things, and we generalize things. That's at the top of the picture, at the top of the head.
Right.
In addition to that, though, we filter every single thing that comes to our mind with our attitudes, our values, our meta programs, what's in the middle down at the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
So to tie all of this together, why does that even matter? Since 95% of what is going on is unconscious, subconscious, all of those things that are going on in our head in the middle of the picture actually create up at the top, left-hand side, our internal representations. That just means how we see things. So if you and I both go to an event or to a movie, it is so amazing that we see different things.
Right.
We experience it differently. We feel differently about it. We remember different things. And it's all because in our heads, we have those filters.
Okay.
But what that does is that creates what we think and how we see things. And sometimes people call it the map inside of our head.
Mm-hmm.
We each have a map of how we perceive things. Ironically, this map up at the top, the internal representation, creates our emotional state. So you've heard it said before that as we think, so we are. That's a verse.
Right.
In that's a King James version of that verse. But the internal representations actually impact our emotional state, and then our emotional state impacts our physiology. So sometimes we feel physically sick.
Right.
And we can
Yeah,
make
absolutely.
ourselves sick. Yeah, we can make
Absolutely.
ourselves sick because of how we're thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So all of those things on the left-hand side, they impact each other. It's a cycle where if we are in a negative state of mind, we will have a negative result emotionally and physiologically. If we put ourselves in a positive state of mind, then we can have a positive emotional state and a positive physical state. So since 95% of what's going on in our world is unconscious, we need to tap into the unconscious in order to change, to really change and to transform what's going on in our lives and in our heads and in our hearts.
Wow. Yeah. And I think most of us don't really think about like that my unconscious is actually controlling like 95%. That's crazy. 95% of what we do is based on our unconscious.
Like we don't think about, oh, how do I get home from the grocery store? We don't think about our body running. What the unconscious mind does is so crazy. 2 or 3 things that I'll just mention about the unconscious mind is that's where all of our emotions are stored. That's where all of our memories are stored. And especially that's where all of our trauma is stored.
Okay.
So in order to process that effectively so that it doesn't come into today in a negative way, we have to access that in order to change it.
Okay. And I know there, I know personally when I went through the short time that I did with you, I was a little skeptical. It was just like, yeah, how can this totally.
You were really skeptical, not a little bit.
Because it's like, okay, how can a conversation, talking about this event? I mean, because some of us, we're so traumatized by things that have happened that, every time we think about it, it just like re-triggers us. And so the thought of having to go, think through it again and talk through it again is sometimes kind of scary for people. And I think especially the Hope for Spouses is really a Christian-based ministry. And so, I think some people may be hesitant because, okay, how can this, how is this, biblically based? I mean, I don't know if the Bible really talks about the unconscious mind, but I know the Bible does talk about the mind, so how would this play into, how do you think God would feel about this whole thing?
So let me address something you said, and I wrote it down so that I won't forget to go back to the biblical basis. But one of the things that you said was that we can be afraid to address those traumas in our life. I'm just going to be really vulnerable here. That assault that happened when I was in the 7th grade, 12 years old, was a sexual assault.
Mm.
And it took me years, maybe 2006. So that was around 79, 80 or something.
Mm-hmm.
It took me many years to be able to talk about it, to even say that I was sexually assaulted. So I understand that to some extent. The awesome thing about this timeline therapy and rewiring our neural circuits is that we don't really even have to talk about the details of the event.
Mm. Wow.
And what we do is we have people to imagine being above themselves on a timeline,
Right,
and
right.
they're looking down on the event, but we never put them inside the event
Okay.
so that people are not re-traumatized. And I myself had EMDR in relation to that assault that happened when I was in the 7th grade. So I wanted to mention that the good news is that we don't have to be re-traumatized as we go through this process to rewire.
Right.
Biblically based, there's so many things that we can say. God, if you want to show the scriptures that we talked about, God has given us his wisdom. And even though I do have 3 master's degrees, I believe he is so much smarter than me. Um, Still, because even today, I'm like, oh my gosh, I still have so much to learn. But Philippians chapter 4, verse 8 and 9, he tells us what to think about. And then in Colossians chapter 3, he tells us to set our mind. And in Isaiah, he says that we can actually have perfect peace. Can you even imagine?
Yeah.
God says we can have perfect
Perfect
peace
peace.
when our mind is steadfast on him.
Mm-hmm.
And so God doesn't really, my question, I was a teacher, a math major in my first career. And my question was always how? How does this
Mm-hmm.
happen? Okay, yeah, we're supposed to do X, Y, Z, 1, 2, 3. And especially as disciples or Christians committed to God, yeah, we know what we're supposed to do. We know, but how do we do it?
Right.
And so God doesn't tell us how to change our oil in our car, you know,
Right.
or, he doesn't tell us how to, deal with diabetes, but amen, that we have resources where we can do those things.
Mm-hmm.
So there are many scriptures that talk about inmost being and scriptures that talk about our mind. So biblically, he doesn't necessarily prescribe exactly how we do it, but he is the one who gave us our innermost being.
Mm-hmm.
He's the one who gave us our mind.
Yeah.
And we need to get it to the place where he wants it to be, where we are focused on the things that he's called us to be focused on.
Yeah, and I know we talk a lot in Hope for Spouses about Romans 12 too, about being transformed by the renewing of our mind, and
Mm-hmm.
it's almost like this is something that the timeline therapy really does. Is it really changes the whole way we think about things. I mean, I remember my experience with you, and it was kind of getting over the experience and looking down on it more subjectively and not being in the middle of it. I think that's where we do get the traumatized, the triggering and stuff is when we're right in the middle of it. And so to think about coming over, it's almost like we're looking at it from God's view and we're looking down on it from a different perspective and able to kind of see all the players there. I think of like the game of life, and how we're like in the little car, we're driving the car with a little peg, and how God can see it. And for us to be able to get over it and see it from a different perspective. I mean, for me, I know that was very freeing and helped me to see it from a whole different light instead of just seeing it through my eyes, to see it from a whole different perspective.
And that's actually the power of the unconscious mind.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the NLP techniques that's pretty common. We have anchoring that's pretty common, or reframing. That's a part of a number of therapies, cognitive behavior therapy, for instance. But what you're talking about is what we call dissociation, where we just take ourselves out of the picture a little bit and are able to see from a different perspective. And what our unconscious mind does when we do that is it actually presents those repressed emotions so that they can be resolved.
Okay.
God just blows me away every single time I see miracles. Like, how could somebody's mind change that quickly?
Right.
And it's because that's how he made us. He knows when we're ready to let go of those things. And at just the time that I needed it, he provided the tool for me to be able to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
What are some of the other techniques? You mentioned a couple of them as far as NLP.
mm-hmm. NLP is mainly used in the business world, believe it or not. But as I mentioned, I didn't mention Tad James yet, but I had training under the Tad James company. He's actually the developer of timeline therapy. So when we go to training, we learn about NLP, we learn about hypnosis, and we learn about timeline therapy. And so with NLP, one of the other biggest things that is used in business is building rapport. But ironically, I'm doing another breakthrough process at this time. I did the first one for my medical issues, my physical health, but now I'm doing one for emotional health. I want to be the best that I can be for God. And it also deals with the strategies for how we get ourselves in some crazy situations, whether it's just mentally or emotionally, and even physically, so we figure out, okay, what's the root issue? And then also, how did we get there? And then how can we reverse that?
Okay.
How can we eliminate, those neural circuits that are just really giving us a hard time? And then how can we put down new ones, have new learnings, and then build on top of that?
Okay. You were saying that they use this in the professional world. I mean, how would you use this in the professional world?
So in the professional world, I would say that this is where it can be misused, because, it just depends on whose hands the techniques are in. Usually for sales, people know how to sell based on NLP. So it's about building rapport with clients and sales. So a lot of businesses learn NLP, a lot of realtors learn NLP, but it's actually about modeling and excellence.
Okay.
So they try to get themselves in a state of excellence so that they can get to the desired outcomes that they want as far as their business and sales is concerned.
So it's transforming their minds to think in more of a more positive way, or if they've got fears about selling or whatever, it helps them to change those thoughts.
Exactly. And to stay in a state, where they can deal with whatever comes at them. And I'm glad you mentioned transformation again, because that's actually the theme scripture on our website, that we can be renewed by the transforming of our mind. That describes timeline therapy exactly, where we actually get to the structure of how we think and change that, and we are transformed in our minds.
Yeah. So, we're all here on Hope for Spouses because we want to be transformed because of the trauma that we've gone through. So, how can timeline therapy really be used in helping spouses that have been traumatized by their spouse's addiction, sexual addiction, or adultery? How can NLP be used in those cases?
It's just so weird how God works. I picked up someone to take them to church this morning, and unfortunately, her husband had cheated on her. And the thing that she said, and then the thing that was said to me at the mall, exactly the same thing. A young lady, she broke up with her boyfriend, and she said, "It's just so hard for me to trust."
Mm-hmm.
And the lady that I picked up for church today, I just don't trust anybody anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens with timeline therapy is that when we eliminate, if you can just go back to that NLP model again of communication.
Yep.
So in the middle, at the bottom, we have attitudes, then we have values and beliefs. So the attitude or the belief that I cannot trust anybody, I believe that starts with ourselves. My personal counselor, beginning in 2003, I was with her for many years. She told me, she said, when you trust yourself, you'll be able to trust other people. I had never heard that before. I was like, wow. And so what timeline therapy does is it eliminates the negative emotions that fuel those harmful attitudes and beliefs. And so trust is a really tricky thing, but that's what I heard twice today. Just that we put up a wall and we're so guarded and we're so afraid. And so, we haven't even touched on anger, but the first thing that we actually eliminate in the entire rewiring timeline therapy process is anger. And so many of us, in going through grief, that is, a major stage in going through grief. And so imagine not having that anger inside of you, that you just don't know how to handle or how to get rid of, it's driving you crazy.
Right.
So I would say anger. So those 5 main emotions that we eliminate are anger, sadness, fear, hurt, and guilt.
Okay.
And I think fear just really kills us.
Yeah.
And what happens is with timeline therapy, we eliminate those things, those emotions connected to past events, so that today we can have warranted or appropriate anger.
Okay.
Not inappropriate.
More like of a godly anger or an indignation over something.
Yeah, or even fear. If a bear is coming, yes, we need to be afraid.
Right.
But, many of us are afraid of being hurt. Many of us are afraid of, missing something or not catching something, so the fears can drive us crazy. So what happens after the process of getting rid of fear, we are left with fear that's only warranted or appropriate. We get rid of any unwarranted in the future. We won't have unwarranted or inappropriate fear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, it's interesting because you were talking about how, we don't trust other people. And I think some of it goes back to we get angry because we don't trust ourselves anymore because we let ourselves be tricked, I know for me, it was like, how could I have gone on for so long? I mean, my husband was a serial adulterer for years, and I don't know if I just closed my eyes to it. I didn't want to see it, but you kind of get to that where you're like, how can I even trust myself? The thought of trusting another person, so that quote that you said was like, wow, that is so true. And I know a lot of the ladies on the Facebook group, they've talked about, how could I have let this happen? And they're angry at themselves. And so that would make so much sense that it's almost like fear and anger are almost tied together in this whole process. And there are these 2 huge roadblocks for us as far as really dealing with these internal wounds.
Yeah. And what's so amazing also is that there are a lot of ways to deal with symptomatic issues, symptomatic behavior, symptomatic attitudes, emotions. But what the timeline therapy process does is it figures out the root. So 2 of my good friends in your group who have done the process, one, and she said I could talk about her. She's just the sweetest person ever. She figured out that when we figure out the root of the issue, where this all started, she figured out that growing up in her home was where she allowed people to misuse her and abuse her. And so that just continued in her life and in her relationship with her husband, even to the point where she blamed herself for it, as opposed to making sure that he took the responsibility that he needed to take, and that she did not take the responsibility that she needed to take. So it was just such an amazing process with her. But the good thing is that with the process with rewiring and the timeline therapy, we figure out what is the root issue that causes all the other problems that we have in our lives.
So, yeah, and that's so true because, in Hope for Spouses, we talk about how, if you're not dealing with the root, the fruit's going to come back, and so you've got to make sure that you're really dealing with the root of the issue. And we talk a lot about that, especially for our addicted partners, that there's a lot of times there's these core wounds that they're medicating, that they're not really dealing with these deep issues, but we sometimes miss that we have our own stuff. And that's kind of why we stay doing what I call the insanity loop. We keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And so, we can have these childhood traumas. I mean, I didn't have a great relationship with my dad. I've talked about that before. And I brought all those issues that I never dealt with as a child, I brought them into my marriage. And so, tell us how that can, NLP can kind of help with that.
So mainly it is, the process is, it's just miraculous. We actually guarantee the process. If it doesn't work, we give money back. Wow. It's that powerful. And even at times where I thought this is not going to work for this person, you know,
Uh-huh.
because they just don't have the faith right now that things can be different.
Okay.
Or they are so deep in those tapes, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
they just, when I doubt, the process is laid out for us. And I had a month's worth of training. So when I shared the whole timeline therapy with someone, they Googled it and tried it themselves. Do not do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Don't do
Google it.
this here. That's one of those little things. Do not do this yourself.
Do not, because you're dealing with the unconscious mind, okay?
Right. Right.
But the process takes us through 13 questions. And it is so amazing because at the beginning, we talk about what's the greater problem. In other words, what's the root issue? By
Right.
the end of the 13 questions, which are just miraculous questions, the guy who developed this, he has a PhD in hypnotherapy. So the words that he uses in these questions, they bring out what's in the unconscious mind, which is amazing. But it's just a conversation. It's a detailed personal history. So what we do is we get to the root issue, the greater problem that is causing all the other problems.
Okay. So this is
And
kind
then
of like the basic walkthrough. If somebody was to come to NLP, this is kind of what you would do.
for this program, so there are NLP counselors who use NLP, but do not use this timeline therapy rewiring
Okay.
process.
Okay.
So NLP you can find in the business world,
Okay.
but the timeline therapy is based on or birthed from NLP. And
Okay. So for timeline therapy, if somebody were it's like they were interested in starting it, what would be a basic process of the treatment? I mean, how would they start it? What would they need to? What would they be doing?
so basically, they can contact me. I'm sure you'll share my information. So I mainly have an initial conversation with people to see what their current issues are, and where they want to go. What are their desired outcomes? And then we go through the detailed personal history process. But actually, before we do that, there are tasks that I give people just to make sure that they kind of loosen up what's going on with them emotionally. So
Hmm.
I ask them actually to journal a bit about their emotions, and sometimes I ask them to do a bit more. But we also have to make sure that they're committed to the process, because change is not easy, and the big follow up for this process, it can take typically only 8 to 10 hours. The big follow-up is that once we lay down those new neural networks, new
Hmm.
neural circuits, we have to reinforce them.
Okay.
And so, God tells us, set our mind, think about such things. So it is magical. It's
Mhm.
unbelievable, but there's work afterwards. So we have an initial appointment. I ask you to do a bit of journaling typically, but it depends. It's different for each person usually. And then we do a detailed personal history, those 13 questions that figures out what the root issues are.
Mhm.
And then we start to eliminate the negative emotions connected to the significant emotional events. And once we do that, we also put a goal in your future,
Okay.
so that you can imagine, reaching that goal, and that goal will set the tone for everything else in your life.
Right.
And then after that, I do a free 30-day follow-up just to check on people to make sure, see how they're doing. And with people who are committed to God, during the process, when we eliminate the negative emotions, there are learnings that go with that. And that's the new neural circuits that we want to lay down. So typically for people who have faith, I ask them to actually find scriptures to go along with those learnings.
Okay.
So, unlike typical talk therapy, which for me, I was in therapy for many years.
Uh-huh.
Typical talk therapy, if you spend 100
Years.
bucks,
Yeah, you can
yeah,
spend
it's
years in it.
years. It's years. And so this process is very efficient,
Mhm.
it's profound, it's effective. It can take, I've had one person to take 21 hours, but on average, there's been about 10 hours for the entire process, which is short, quick, fast, and we're a different person because we change what's going on inside of our
Inside.
heads.
Yeah, you're dealing with the root. You're dealing with the root of the issue. So that makes a huge difference.
Exactly.
Now, I mean, we've talked a lot about the pros, the positives. I mean, it is incredible. I mean, are there any cons? I mean, is it for everyone? Is there anybody who would not benefit from it?
Personally, okay, so the folks who do not benefit from this process are those who don't want to change.
Mm.
So many times in our lives, for instance, we can have secondary gains. I'm not sure if you guys have talked about
No,
those
go ahead.
things.
Go ahead and explain that.
So, if I live as a victim, I have to make a decision as to whether I want to continue to live as a victim or if I want to live as a victor.
Okay.
So there's some benefits to being a victim.
Oh, yes,
Oh,
there are. There certainly are.
so those are what we call the secondary gains. For instance, I don't have to take responsibility if I'm a victim.
Right.
And I don't have to have people mad at me for calling them to account if I'm a victim.
Mm-hmm.
Or people will feel bad for me and give me attention if I'm a victim.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what a secondary gain is.
Okay.
So this does not work for people who do not want to be different.
Right. Yeah. And that makes so much sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, and that really applies to a lot of things in life, I mean, whatever it is, we never get anywhere if we're going to make excuses and blame everybody. I mean, our spouse has done that to us for a long time, and that's even how we can sometimes look at our spouse and know if they really want to change, is if they're making excuses or deflecting. But we always have to examine ourselves and go, okay, am I any different? We can really get upset with our spouse because why do they keep acting this way? Why do they keep doing this? But yet we stay in the same patterns. So it's so interesting that you bring that up because it really makes us look at ourselves in the mirror. I mean, James 1 talks about, you look at yourself in the mirror and you don't change. It's like, I mean, you can't even call yourself, call yourself a Christian. You say, I do the Bible, what the Bible says, but yet you're not changing. And so it's interesting that even something like this, as powerful as this is, we can hold ourselves back from changing, just because we're choosing to, I'm going to be a victim or I'm not going to accept responsibility for this. So even in something like this, it's amazing how it does have that effect.
Yeah. And, there's some people who have tried every program under the sun. And, they are not the issue. It's the person who did the program. It's the program. It's program number 3, it's program number 10,
Right.
and that happens a lot in recovery. So, people who are having addiction issues, this program works for them too.
Right.
But they have to want to change. And so before we start the detailed personal history, some of the tasks that I give actually check to see, is this person really going to be committed? Because I don't want to waste their time. I don't want to waste their money.
Right.
And, it's, if we go back to the manure, if we go back to, it doesn't do us any good.
Right. Right.
And so we try to check to make sure somebody is really ready and wanting to change.
Yeah. Yes. So, any closing thoughts, anything you wanted to share with the ladies here, give them some hope, give them some inspiration about how to get unstuck from where they're at?
I think about that, the next to the last slide that we talked about, healing trauma, where to start. So it's amazing how a friend here, I just moved to Brevard County, their Bible, they really, really know the Bible, which is amazing. And she was the one who told me that in the Old Testament, the heart is really, no, the brain was called the heart. That it wasn't until the New Testament, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. In the Old Testament, heart was mind. And then I asked another teacher, Joey Harris, and when we talked about the innermost being, he also shared that same sentiment. And I was like, wow, that in the Old Testament, the heart was considered the mind, Wow. So that was just so amazing to me, because I think about, if you have that slide, if we change our brain, we can radically change our lives. And you may have heard that book from Daniel Amen, Change Your Brain, Change Your Life. But not only our lives, for me, I went into this process to change my body. I had medical issues. we can actually, they say women can be so emotional, and our emotions can get us in trouble and get us into fights and arguments with our spouses, and just a cycle of dysfunction.
Yep.
So when we change our brains, we can actually change our emotional state
Yep.
and our spirit. They said I look like I had a facelift. My friend who did the breakthrough process, she could not stop crying. And in 2 hours, instead of doing the detailed personal history, we did the timeline therapy first to get rid of her sadness, because she just could not stop crying.
Wow.
And after probably about after an hour, she said, "I'm happy." I'm like, whoa. So going from someone who could not stop crying, to someone who's like, "I'm happy," that's just amazing. All because we changed and rewired her circuits.
Yep.
So we can change our thinking, we can change our internal representations, we can change our relationships. It does take two to tango. And so, in any relationship, we do have a part. We can change our reactions. And I have to really work on this. My mom, unfortunately, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, but I have to consistently think, okay, let me react in a godly way to what's going on with my mom and the things that she's saying and the things that she's doing. And with that, the last part of the process is that we think about, how do we want our lives to be in 5 to 10 years? And since we've gotten rid of the root that has been causing so many issues, the level of hope and the ability to have new choices is in front of people who do this process.
Right.
And that to me is just so encouraging, that they're no longer weighed down by these negative emotions that have controlled them for so long. So that's where the hope is there. And that's exciting to me.
Yeah, I know for me too, one of the things that encourages me, and we talk about this a lot in Hope for Spouses, is that when we change, it actually impacts our children for the long haul, because otherwise we're just going to pass on, our kids get re-traumatized. I was reading in an article how that when there's trauma in one generation, that they actually found changes in the brain and changes in the DNA 4 generations later from victims from Auschwitz, and it's like, wow, we can be carrying generations of trauma, and yet something like this, and in the scriptures, it's so cool because God and science work together. They're not against each other. How when we do transform our thinking, it changes the rest of our lives, but it can also impact our kids, because they're going to grow up with a whole different set of a home culture that's very different from anything else, which will give them ultimately a whole different future.
Yeah, and that's what I love about it. I mean, the scripture that we didn't get to talk about was 2 Corinthians 10:5. That's I think the 5th slide, that we can actually demolish the arguments and the pretensions and the strongholds that are out to get us. And we can change, I can't think of the word I want to use, but we can change the direction in the future by changing what's going on inside of our head.
Right.
So God gives us the power and the tools to be able to take captive, every thought and make it obedient to Christ. And I always wondered, how do I do this? I wanted to do it so badly. And so I'm just so grateful that my supervisor introduced me to this. It's radically changed my life. And I've been able to witness it radically change other people's lives. So I'm just so grateful that I get to share it.
Well, thank you so much, Cresenda. I'm so grateful. I mean, Cresenda and I have known each other for years, and I was like, when she told me she was starting to do this, I was like, we have to talk. You have to talk to my people. So I'm really great. I'm really excited for you as you continue moving forward this, so that we can continue to help people, which is what discipleship is all about, is us helping others. So if you're really wanting to get started in healing some of that deep internal trauma, I really encourage you to go ahead and contact Cresenda. I'm going to go ahead and put her information up on the screen. You can either call her, go ahead and check her website and see some of the testimonials she has there. And we do have a few ladies from Hope for Spouses that have seen some great victory in working with Cresenda. And I'm so grateful that you came to join us today at our Lunchtime Live. And we look forward to seeing you next week on Hope for Spouses. Take care. Have a great one.